Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is Thursday, November 7th, 9 o'clock Eastern, 6 o'clock Pacific, and we are back after a 2-month hiatus here at the No Name Cinema Society. We're here tonight to kick off our 57th series of episodes with a review of the current feature, Motherless Brooklyn. Ladies and gentlemen, hi, I am Jonathan Betzler, and as you can see, we're reviewing Motherless Brooklyn tonight, and I'm back here in my Los Angeles home briefly. It's my first time here since the end of July. We did a show here, the top 5 60s Westerns, but I'm back here right now, but I leave for New York tomorrow. So with the Indie Spotlight on Monday, I'll be back in New York. So make sure to tune in for that. But speaking of Los Angeles, I've got a couple of LA buds to co-host with me tonight here at the No Name Cinema Society. First, a power-hungry narcissist, Devin Michaels, is here.
It's a hard habit to break.
Since George Pappas, one of our society members, is on hiatus to do a show in Nantucket, or he will be soon, we're going to bring back an old favorite out of retirement, last seen in our Oscar preview last February, and he just recently got over his brain affliction. Ladies and gentlemen, Ryan Turner is back!
Whole couple-month retirement.
February seems so long ago, you know, I mean, like, I hear what you're saying. All right, guys, first thing we're going to do is go over the schedule for this, our 57th series of episodes. Of course, it starts right now tonight with a review of Motherless Brooklyn. It continues this Monday, November 11th, with a review of our Indie Spotlight, Two Lovers, from director James Gray. Next Thursday, we do our Indie Spotlight, John Cassavetes' film Faces from 1968. And on Monday, November 18th, there'll be our 41st Sound Off, in which George will do his last show in a while. We'll have Patrick, and we're going to play the movie game. I'm going to do a character actor spotlight in the segment we call What's Their Bucket? And I've been tasked with counting down my top 5 John Cassavetes films of all time. All right, guys, are you ready for the summary?
Yeah.
Motherless Brooklyn. Lionel has a Tourette syndrome kind of affliction, something that the world around him in New York in the 50s did not know how to deal with exactly. But Private Eye Frank Minna took him in and showed him the ropes of his business. When Frank is murdered on a case, Lionel has to overcome his disability as much as he can to get to the bottom of who killed his mentor and why. Guys, how do you feel about that summary?
Accurate.
It's a good start as far as summaries go. All right, so Devin is generally pretty terrible at opening thoughts, so I thought we should have Ryan start us off because to welcome him back and also to give Devin a good template of how it should be done. As I got a siren passing me here. Ryan, one sentence, if you could. Motherless Brooklyn, how'd you feel?
Definitely bloated, but interesting.
It wasn't even like a full sentence. I love it. Just a few words here and there. Adjectives. I dig it. Devin, can you summarize your feelings in one sentence?
I generally just agree with what Ryan said. Overall, it could have used some streamlining and less self-importance, but I did like it and found it generally enjoyable and well executed. So,
for me, it's very hard for adaptations to fulfill the expectations of books that you love. This is one of my favorite writers, as I said in the vlog the other day, and this falls into that category of failing to fulfill the expectations. It's a fairly mixed bag, and I'll get into the quibbles momentarily, but I always like to start on the things that were positives, at least for me, and we'll see if these guys disagree. And I think, for me, the most positive thing about the film are the performances overall. With the occasional exception, which I'll get to, the ensemble, to me, on the whole, is very strong, bringing vivid life to characters that are so indelible in the source material. Guys, before we get into individual performances, do you agree with the general conceit that the ensemble is really strong?
I would agree.
Yeah.
Right?
The caliber of the actor in the movie is a very high bar.
Yeah.
So I feel like the baseline for when you have a cast like this is going to be solid performances.
Right. I mean, a lot of theater-trained people. Let's start then in talking about individual performances with Edward Norton. I remember vividly when Norton announced he wanted to adapt and star in the film version of this, because I was in the middle of reading it at the time. It was way back in like 2004, 2005. That's how long I was reading this, and that's how long Edward Norton has been trying to make this movie happen. So he's been in my head as Lionel all this time. Truthfully, he's probably too old at this point to play the character as written. As someone who's read the book, I might be in the minority on that, and it's ultimately a minor distraction. It seems to me that he really understood the essence of the character and beautifully captured the affliction without ever feeling put on or forced. it was a part of him. The physicality of the performance particularly impressed me. His gait, G-A-I-T, his posture, his whole presence shifted to reflect Lionel's sad background and also his growing confidence as the movie goes along.
Yeah, he's an excellent actor. He gave himself a platform here on which to demonstrate that for 2.5 hours.
Do you feel like it's a little indulgent in that regard?
I mean, the problem is I think it's indulgent in terms of the overall production.
Ryan, Edward Norton.
Yeah, I mean, I think, like Devin said, he's obviously a very talented actor. It feels like somewhat of an Oscar baity role. Like, it feels like one of those roles that actors take to kind of flex their craft. It was like good. Like, I don't think I'm gonna go back and say like that was the best performance I've ever seen. He did the job and, you know, functioned to tell the story. And obviously wasn't the easiest role to pull off, but I think he did a great job.
It might be Oscar worthy in my mind. It's borderline though. I don't know if he would have made my top 5 last year, but this year he's a contender, I think, at least for now in early November. As Ryan insinuated, because the ensemble is there's so many of them, I just figured I would talk about a few of my standouts and then a few of my quibbles, rather than get into each individual performance. So let's start with some of my standouts, and it's always a pleasure to see Michael Kenneth Williams. He's such a force on the screen, and he makes the most out of a small role. I actually could not find a still of him in the film, online at least. That's how small his role is in the film. Similarly, I couldn't find a still about this next actor, and it's actually an actor I've worked with in the past. It has been a while, so I almost didn't recognize Dallas Roberts in the important role of Danny. We worked together in 2001 on a film called The Lucky Ones. Shortly thereafter, he got me tickets to a production of Burn This in Manhattan, and he was a supporting character in that production, and the leads were played by Catherine Keener and Edward Norton. So that's how far back Dallas and Edward go. And he impressed me back in 2001 on that film, The Lucky Ones. It was great to see him deliver the goods in a big movie like this. In limited screen time, he feels like a fully realized character of a very specific place and time, very relaxed in his approach, which made his relationship with his colleagues seem all the more natural. And the final standout to me is I do want to highlight Alec Baldwin. Granted, he gets a lot of practice playing a demagogue on Saturday Night Live, so I guess it's not a surprise that he's very compelling as Moses Randolph. With his recent comedy and caricature work, sometimes we forget how good he can be and his range. So I feel like he digs in on this character who totally seems to believe he has the best interests of the future generations in mind. So those were my standouts amongst the cast. Do you disagree with any of those, agree, or have some of your own that you want to talk about?
I think Alec Baldwin, was a standout for me too. I think he did a really great job. Definitely he dropped in sprinkles of his Trump in there, like you were saying, but it's kind of like a more grounded, realistic form of it. But he even says, like, make this city great again. And I'm just like, okay, like, I get it. Yeah. But like, and I don't know if that's in the book or whatever. But
it is, and the book was well before like Trumpism, and I mean and the character I know Devin knows because we saw the movie together, but Ryan, I don't know if you know. I mean, it's based on a real life character.
Yeah.
You know about Robert Moses.
Yeah, I know that. Yeah, he's a really interesting character in general. But researching a little bit.
This is a great book, The Power Broker. But I mean, like, I really like how Baldwin didn't necessarily villainize him. Like, he really believed the things that he was saying. At least that's the way I interpret the performance. Devin.
Performance-wise, I think he was very strong and, very grounded.
One of my misses is Bobby Cannavale, because, I mean, I've seen him on stage, and he can be such a dominating presence. But in the recent film work he's done, I feel like he's doing the bare minimum. Like, where is the Bobby Cannavale from The Station Agent and Kingpin and things like that? He plays such an important character here, but those scenes seem to be devoid of subtext for me, particularly the scenes when it was just the two of them. Cannavale, I wished had offered more in what turned out to be an important character.
I would argue that some of the little off notes in the first half of his performance were perhaps a choice in terms of him hiding something.
I had read the book, so I knew what was going to happen, so I didn't necessarily feel that. Ryan.
I didn't think he was a miss to me. I didn't think he was incredible. I think the bar for his performances is so high. So it's like, yeah, he did fine. Like, he did a fine job. It wasn't like anything that was like, this is a really standout. And I think, yeah, you're right. He definitely has that in him to be that potential. But I don't think, like, I didn't watch it and be. I didn't particularly think he was someone that stood out as negative. I think he did his job for me.
Well, I guess maybe I also have unfair expectations of him, as that could also be true of this other actor, too, that I had a bump with. Willem Dafoe is an actor that's come up a lot on the show recently. Ryan was here when we did a review of Murder in the Orient Express. He was also here when we had Florida. Devin and I both had Florida Project on our top 10. George had At Eternity's Gate on his top 10 last year. We've talked about Wild at Heart in our 1990 interview, and of course, Devin is aware he was in both Mississippi Burning and The Last Temptation of Christ from our 1988 review. So he's a friend of the show in a way, if you will. But here his role is problematic on the page, which I'll get to. And so Willem Dafoe isn't able to do much with it. There's a lot to mine here in his performance, and his choices just seemed haphazard to me and over the top at times. There are different and more compelling ways to show that intensity and desperation. I did not buy Willem Dafoe here. He's a miss for me. Ryan?
I didn't personally think him as a miss. I think I'd probably put him in the same as Bobby Cannavale, like just kind of I don't know. I could see what you're saying when you mention it. It's like, yeah, he was kind of not specific in what he was doing. But I think I also have like the just seeing Willem Dafoe. Has that innate, like I guess it's creepiness presence. Yeah. He has like but he does have like especially like if he's got the beard and he's like and I'm like, oh, he's gonna like kill somebody or something. So it's like a weird casting choice.
Willem Dafoe's creepy. Speaking of creepy, Devin, how do you
exactly feel? This is why I look up to him so much. I definitely hear what you're saying. I do think he struggled a bit with this character. I think there were certain aspects of the screenplay, and specifically how the screenplay treats his character, that made a lot of this performance a slog for him. It seemed like just always interesting watching him on screen, even when you can tell if you look with a very close eye that this might not have been his best work.
For more on Willem Dafoe, you can check out the argument that Devin and I had on our 1988 review when we argued about his performance in Mississippi Burning. I do want to talk about direction and screenplay. We've already talked about what a deft hand Edward Norton was in terms of guiding the performances. In terms of the shot choices, for me, it was a bit of a mixed bag because a lot of the coverage is basic with a good mix of wides and close-ups. And I also like how he dealt with Lionel's memories. And it looked almost like 8mm he used with a rewind effect that helped a little in terms of getting inside Lionel's jumbled head. Other attempts at flair felt a little flat to me. For example, I feel like a weed-induced dream sequence early in the film seemed a little flashy for its own good, and it never returned to that style. There's shots of like huge shadows coming up to buildings and in a very awkward, unbelievable way. There's a cool shot of a character walking in the reflection of a large puddle, but then we cut across the street and there's no water anywhere. Those are the sort of forced visuals that take me out of it. It feels like a big puddle was put there just for the shot. Guys, awkward visuals here and now and then that you're trying to be flashy, but it didn't quite work for me.
Yeah, for sure. Alec Baldwin's character introduction was a specific style. It felt like, okay, let's cover this very basically on sticks for most of the movie, or like maybe not even, I just felt like it was very basic and like not interesting. And then there'd be like, oh, let's try one thing here. And then it was not ever maintained. So the style was so like, just kind of like, oh, this could be cool. And then this could be cool. But it never felt like part of the overall. It didn't feel like one cohesive vision. It felt like a bunch of cool ideas. Every element was like, oh, they'd do something cool, but it never was consistent.
Yeah, I agree with you guys. I think it was inconsistent. The phrase that came to mind when I was driving home was, it's sort of like if a student film had $100 million.
That's funny.
It's not.
Yeah, that's a good point.
There were some good, really strong ideas, and he's obviously a very smart guy.
It's not his first film. Do you guys remember his first film? It was a long time ago, but
was it the one with Marlon Brando?
No, but his first film was a comedy with Jenna Elfman and Ben Stiller.
Yeah, I vaguely remember that coming and going.
He and Ben Stiller are priests that both fall in love with Jenna Elfman, and the hilarity ensues.
Yeah, there's a lot of quality here, and a lot of those choices that you were referring to, the directorial flourishes, they were hit and miss, but there were some hits. And I think, I wish there were more of the hits that he made that kept things moving.
I was going to skip this part, but since you brought it up, I actually think there's a lot of problems with the editing. And sometimes I feel like he was cutting corners to make things faster. like, and too fast, I think, in some cases, for the narrative's sake. And is an overall mission to cut the movie down, which I understand, but the net result are some awkward cuts and scenes that felt like choppy. And I'm referring specifically that there's failures in the in-scene editing, almost like he went through scenes and like try to chop frames wherever he could to just like tighten it. And sometimes it felt too fast, whereas my favorite scenes were the ones that where he let things breathe a little bit, slow things down. And there was a conversation with Laura on the street at one point in the film, one of their early conversations that they have together. And then later on in the club when he's there for the first time and then they're dancing. Those are the scenes in which I started to feel some magic, particularly scenes with Laura. The other scenes I felt he was like cutting off jokes too soon. And like, Ryan, you're an editor, so maybe you have some thoughts on this. Sometimes I felt like it was too fast for its own good. Like I wasn't getting the point of a scene or the emotion of a scene.
And I'll caveat this by saying I was very tired and I watched it late in the night, but I don't think anything in this film was too fast. Like, to me, I was just like, wow, this is really...
When it was cutting too quickly, it was like he was trying to get all the shots that he shot in the scene.
I'm not disagreeing with you. I feel like, to me, what I'm saying is directorially, this whole thing felt like a loose handshake. I do agree with you that some of those cuts, it was clearly trying to expedite certain things, but it wasn't motivated by like a choice in the production.
Agreed. The Band-Aids almost.
I think we're in agreement that there wasn't a cohesive directorial style here. There was some strong ideas in terms of photography, editing, all of these things, but it was not consistent. It didn't seem to have one inspired approach.
And on top of all that, there was some bad AD work. I'm telling you, the extras in this movie were very awkwardly staged.
That is interesting.
And like the Penn Station, there's a rally in Washington Square Park, and it was very awkward, and they performed badly. And like, if you're an AD, you gotta swap out the bad extras, dude. I mean, like, come on.
I was aware that it was a set with people walking by. It's weird you mentioned that because I didn't think about that. It's like I wouldn't have brought that up. But like there was a couple times where I'm like, oh, this is just not reality. And it was really sparse in certain parts too, where you're like, isn't this a city? What is But yeah, like I'm not normally aware of this.
And sometimes they were like, you know, some big scenes were like set up as awkward tableaus that Lionel walked through, and I'm like, there's no naturalism to the scene. And again, it's a lack of cohesive vision. Like, you know, all of a sudden we're gonna have this like weird Penn Station tableau scene. But I do want to take a minute here to point out something that we don't talk about that often on the show, but we should, is the score, because most of us don't really have the vernacular to talk about it intelligently, except for maybe Patrick. But 4 years ago, I talked about how impressed I was with Daniel Pemberton's score for The Man from U.N.C.L.E. And he's back here again with an extremely different, beautiful, and seemingly unique score, unique in its apparent combination of influences, from classical Hollywood sound invoking the film noirs of the 40s to a jazz and blues feel for those appropriate scenes. And those two concepts never felt disparate. He meshed them together in a very effective way. I don't have a lot of time to talk about it, but it is one of the better scores I've heard this year, and maybe in a few years, possibly one of the better things about the movie. I like the score a lot, guys. Do you guys have anything on the score?
Agree completely.
Yeah, I agree.
All right, cool. All right, so we don't have a lot of time, but let's, you know, the big issue with the film might be the screenplay. I have two issues with the screenplay, and first I'm going to start with perspective. First, with most detective stories, the most effective way to tell the story is with the limited perspective, as in the audience discovers things along with the detective. It keeps an audience interested. This film does that mostly, but it does cut away from Lionel at times and sees things he doesn't see, which breaks his own rule. If they did it more, like, for example, in North by Northwest, then that's the language of the film, and that's okay. But here they do it so infrequently that it's just awkward when they do it. Along the same lines, the book is told entirely from Lionel's jumbled head. You have to decipher the Lionel and then unravel the plot as well. And the script and the film never put me inside his head as thoroughly. It's a difficult thing to do. I had a vision of how to do it while reading the book that this script didn't capture. There's a 2007 film from Scott Frank called The Lookout that does a better job of putting us inside the head of a protagonist that's a little mixed up. Guys, this issue of perspective in the script.
I'm a big fan of The Lookout, actually, and it did come to mind when I was watching this. It was, like a lot of the other things we're discussing, a little inconsistent here.
I agree. I feel like it goes back to what we're talking about with Division. I think it's just it's not, it doesn't feel cohesive because it doesn't feel consistent, and it's the same as the shots.
So the other issue I have with the film is exposition, which is always such a challenge for detective stories. The delineation of information, how to do it smoothly without overwhelming your audience or hitting them over the head. This script does cut some corners in that regard. Again, maybe potentially trying to squeeze it all in. It partially uses VO, though I did sense he was trying to be careful with that and not give us too much too soon with the VO. But the alternative to that is giving a lot of the exposition through the Willem Dafoe character, divulging information in long ranting speeches that just feels like too much of an information dump. There are other scenes and montages which do a better, i.e. more visual job of this, but it stood out to me when Edward Norton wrote himself into a corner in terms of exposition. It just felt clunky at times to me.
There's a lot of scenes of just people being like, here's what happened, here's why it was done. Oh, and here's what's going to happen. Yeah, it didn't feel like a very innovative way to get it across.
I think overall it was an example of over-analytical writing.
Devin doesn't know anything about that.
Which I can speak to. It's a script that was clearly worked on a lot. And it's a script that in moments, because it was worked on a lot by smart people, it has some great moments. What it suffers from, similar to what we were describing with some of the other aspects directorially, it suffers from not having a single inspiration. This is what the flow is. Instead, it was just like, we are muscling through this with intellect, and it's a little in love with itself.
Sometimes that intellect, you lose some of the life, some of the vitality in a piece.
Yeah.
There's a love story in it. I didn't really buy it. A lot of the story banked on the fact that it's this relationship between this main protagonist and Frank. Not that I didn't buy it, but I didn't really care. Like, I don't care about that guy. I saw him for like 5. He's not like a big part of this movie. Up, for example, and within those certain amount of times, they have this montage that actually does make you successfully care about this relationship of these two characters. And then that is driving the whole movie. I really feel like that movie, it is a rare example of being able to do that. Not having read the story, I was like, I don't care about Frank. Like, I want to move on.
I don't really have a perspective on that because, in the book, Frank he hangs over the whole proceedings. He's like a specter in a good way. I felt that relationship in the book, and I guess I carried that with me into the movie. So maybe Devin's a better person to respond to this. You know, he doesn't read much to begin with, so he didn't read the book. What do you think? Did you feel that too, having not read the book?
No, that didn't bother me. I thought that there was enough established in the early couple of scenes, and there was enough of the other characters, not just Lionel, clearly having a connection with him when they discuss how they were all essentially saved by him. There was enough there that didn't bother me.
Sort of how I felt about it, but it might have been carrying that from the book. Are you guys ready to move on?
Yeah.
I think Devin's going to like this part. Ladies and gentlemen, it's the T word, where we talk about themes. We try to dig a little deeper and discuss what this movie was really about to us. And Devin already hinted that, this movie's themes, it sort of came at you like a hammer with some of these themes. Like, it wasn't shy about wanting to be about something a little more relevant to today's society. To me, I'm going to sum up the main theme as male white privilege. I was originally going to say it was about power, but it was more than that, I think. The power and the privilege that they had was about keeping down other races and genders, whether intentionally or not. Now, having read this book, The Power Broker, about the real Robert Moses, as opposed to this fictional Moses Randolph, I'm not sure the real Robert Moses cared who he was displacing. As the film alluded, he was more concerned about his legacy, and ironically, that lack of compassion has tainted his legacy. We judge him while we happily enjoy all of his works, those that spend a lot of time in New York, the parks and the bridges that make our lives happier and easier. But this film takes pains to point out the disadvantage of anyone who was other than a white male. Not just African Americans, but women, Jews, and in Lionel's case, the disabled. Guys, male white privilege is what I have as one of the main themes I took away from it. Agree, disagree, and anything more on that?
I think that's one of the themes. And
I have more. This is one of the main ones that stuck with me.
Yeah. One of the things that does get accomplished pretty well with this type of filmmaking is getting across these big ideas. Perhaps it focuses on them too much, and that's why some of the rest of the storytelling was sprawling and not as focused as we would like. But in terms of the big themes, I think that's where the strengths of this movie come out. And that's part of why overall it was more of a hit than a miss for me. I think it's also about some of these larger questions of how we ought to organize society.
That's my next theme, yeah.
It's not hitting you over the head, but it's definitely saying, hey, we're going there.
I disagree. I do think it's heavy-handed, I think. I feel like it would have been more effective if it was a little more subtle without the Willem Dafoe speeches and things like that. Ryan, do you have anything on this theme?
Yeah, I mean, I think I just had a different experience, and it could have been just because I was really tired. But I didn't like I understood and thought it was interesting the kind of discourse it was bringing up about stuff like that, but it just didn't feel like the best version of like what that could be. I don't know if it was because heavy-handed or if it was just because I felt like it was trying to say a lot of different things.
So the other thing that Devin was alluding to, you talk about the way that we organize society, and so it did make me think a lot about capitalism. And I do think the film points out some of the holes in capitalism as it tends not to allow for shifts in power. It also points out the lack of compassion that is an inadvertent byproduct of a system that was designed to protect us from the greedy. The film elevates and admires those that try to do something for the greater good, those that think outside their own self-interest. In the case of Moses, the final results of many of his works were positive historically, but his interests were about his own legacy and not necessarily the greater good. And further, he steamrolled people to get there. And the film wonders, though doesn't answer whether or not there's a better way. That's sort of what you're referring to, Devin.
Absolutely. And I think one of the reasons I didn't think it was heavy-handed is because it doesn't seem to take a definite stand on that. I think it did, as you just alluded to, it did sort of allow you to wonder about this as a question, as an open question. Is there a way to do this better? Is there something about the way that Moses Randolph's character accomplishes things that we do need? We do need that kind of drive and innovation to keep us moving forward into the future, right, to keep us growing, to keep us thriving. It's a complex question, obviously. This film allows it to be. It doesn't try to say, oh, all these people at the town hall are 100% correct, because I think it portrays some of them as kind of short-sighted. There's a yin and yang there.
The only voice for progress as far as the greater good is concerned is Alec Baldwin, and he's portrayed so villainously that I do feel like, and he is a villain for all intents and purposes, like he's, there's murders and things like that under his watch, but at the same time, that's what's so compelling about, and maybe knowing what I know about Robert Moses in his book, The Power Broker, shifted my mind on that, because this is a more complex situation. What I think the film fails to do is sufficiently show that other point of view. Because if it was more than just Alec Baldwin saying it, then I feel like it would be maybe less heavy-handed and more even-keeled, and really challenge us to ask that question by showing both sides. Devin, to your point, I do agree with you on one thing, that I do feel like the clearest objective in terms of his vision is trying to hammer home some of these themes, and maybe too much so. Sometimes I always talk about filmmaking as like layers of a cake, and I always say like the main story should be the foundation, and then you build up from there. And if you can use that story to make comments about society and moving forward in progress and things like that, then great, all the better. It's a fuller cake if you do, but don't lose sight of that ground level. And I feel like that is where this film went awry. And it sounds like Ryan agrees.
Yep.
All right, I'm definitely going to close out. We're so long right now. All right, guys. So we're going to try and do our next set of episodes, our 58 series episodes. Our next current feature, I'm hoping, is going to be Thursday, December 5th, in which we talk about the film Queen and Slim. So I'm hoping that's going to come up. But before that is this Monday, November the 11th. We're going to do our Indie Spotlight. I believe I'm going to have Patrick and Alex for that. And we're going to do Two Lovers, the film directed by James Gray from 2009, starring Joaquin Phoenix and Gwyneth Paltrow. And again, that's coming up this Monday, November the 11th. In the meantime, ladies and gentlemen, this meeting of the No Name Cinema Society is adjourned.